My daughter called me on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. Not a real call. The text. Hey, Dad, just wanted to give you a heads up about Christmas. We're doing it at Colton's parents' place this year. His whole family's coming in from Edmonton, so it's going to be pretty packed, just keeping it to immediate family on his side. You understand, right? Hope you have a good one. I read it twice. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went back to the soup I was making. I didn't respond that day either. She didn't follow up. That probably tells you everything you need to know about where things had gotten between us. A year ago, she would have called. Even 2 years ago, she would have at least pretended she felt bad about it. But that Tuesday in November, she sent me a text like she was canceling a dentist appointment, and when I didn't answer, she didn't think to check if I was all right. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in the house where she grew up, in a small city about 40 minutes outside of Ottawa. My wife, her mother, passed away 4 years ago. Breast cancer. We had 31 years together, and I'm not going to pretend that losing her didn't change things for all of us. It changed everything. My daughter. I'll call her by what I called her when she was little, which was just my girl, because that's how I still think of her even now. She took it hard. We all did. But somewhere in the grieving, she and I stopped talking the way we used to. She got busy with Colton and the kids. I understood that. I didn't blame her for it. But there's a difference between life being busy and a person deciding you're optional. And somewhere between that first quiet Christmas without her mother and the November she sent me that text, I had become optional. Here's something I didn't mention when my daughter sent that text. I had already made plans. Not plans I'd made out of spite or anticipation. Plans that had come together over the previous few months, almost by accident, because that's how good things tend to arrive when you stopped expecting them. Her name was June. She was 64, recently retired from 30 years of teaching elementary school in the Glebe neighborhood of Ottawa. And she had the kind of laugh you could hear from another room and not mind one bit. We'd met at a community woodworking class I'd signed up for in September, mostly because my doctor had told me I needed to get out of the house more and I needed something to do with my hands. June was making a small cabinet for her kitchen. I was making what was supposed to be a step stool but was turning out crooked. She didn't make fun of me. She handed me a clamp and showed me what I was doing wrong, and we talked for 3 hours while our project sat there half finished. And when the class ended, she said, "Same time next Thursday?" And I said yes, before I'd even thought about it. We'd been seeing each other for about 6 weeks when my daughter sent that text. I hadn't told my daughter yet. I hadn't told either of my kids yet. I was still figuring out what it was, what to call it, whether I was ready to give it a name out loud. My son, he lives out in Victoria, had a sense something was different when we talked on the phone. He said I sounded lighter. I told him I'd taken up woodworking. He laughed and said, "Sure, Dad, whatever you say." My daughter hadn't noticed anything, which maybe should have told me something too. After the text, I thought about the previous 3 Christmases. The first one, right after we lost my wife, had been at my house. Everyone came. My daughter and Colton and the grandkids drove in from Canada. My son flew in from BC, and we were all together and sad. In the way you're sad when the person who made the holiday feel like itself isn't there anymore. My wife was the one who made the tortilla from scratch every year, who put the paper bag of oranges and walnuts in everyone's stockings because her own mother had done it that way, who stayed up too late wrapping gifts in the kitchen with the radio on low. Without her, we tried. We really did. But the house felt like a stage set without a show. The second Christmas, my daughter hosted. It was fine. Her house was warm and the kids were excited, and Colton's parents came and it was crowded and loud, and I sat at one end of the table and mostly watched. I drove home that night on the 417 in the dark, and I told myself I'd felt included, and I mostly believed it. The third Christmas, I was invited for the 26th. Not the 25th. The 26th. We're doing something low-key on Boxing Day, Dad. Does that work? It worked. I brought a bottle of wine and leftover shortbread I'd made myself, and I left by 8 o'clock, because the kids were tired, and Colton had work in the morning. And now this. A text in November. Just keeping it to immediate family on his side. I was her father. I had been her father for 34 years. I coached her soccer team when she was 9. I drove 6 hours to be there when she graduated from Carleton. I sat in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours when she had her first baby, because Colton's whole family was already in the delivery suite, and there wasn't space. And I didn't say a word about it, not one word, because it wasn't about me. And somehow, somewhere, I had become not immediate family. I texted her back on Thursday. No problem, have a good one. 4 words, that was all. No guilt trip, no explanation, no do you realize what you're saying to me. Just 4 words, and then I put my phone back in my pocket and called June and asked if she had any plans for Christmas. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, my kids are going to be with their father's side of the family in Montreal. So no, I don't have plans." I said, "Would you want to spend it with me?" Another pause. "I'd like that very much." We decided to keep it simple. June's apartment was in a building near the Rado River, one of those older low-rises with wide windows and parquet floors. She'd lived there for 11 years, and it felt like her, full of books, and plants that were actually alive, and a small wood stove in the corner that she'd had the landlord approve when she moved in, because she said she couldn't live without a real fire in winter. We planned to cook together. She wanted to do a roast chicken because it was her mother's recipe, and she hadn't made it in years. I offered to bring a bottle of Ontario Red and the ingredients for a proper cheese board, the kind my wife used to put together with the aged cheddar from that little shop on Bank Street. June said perfect. I said I'd be there by noon. Christmas morning, I woke up earlier than I'd expected. Snow was coming down outside my bedroom window, not the heavy wet kind, but the light kind that catches the light and turns the yard blue and silver. I stood there for a while in the dark watching it, and I thought about my wife. I do that most mornings still. I think some part of me always will. But then I thought about the day ahead of me. The smell of a real kitchen with real cooking in it, sitting across a table from someone who was glad I was there. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something simple, like the low warmth you get from a lamp in a room you're comfortable in. I got dressed and drove into Ottawa. June had carols on the radio when I got there, not the cheesy ones, the old ones. A CBC recording of a choir she liked, something she'd listened to every Christmas since she was a girl. She had a small tree in the corner with white lights and a handful of ornaments that were clearly decades old, mismatched and beautiful. We cooked together all afternoon. I'd forgotten what it felt like, cooking with someone. My wife and I used to do it all the time, not as a project, just as the ordinary rhythm of an evening. One person at the stove and one chopping, passing things back and forth without having to ask. June and I found that rhythm without trying. She seasoned the chicken, and I made a pan sauce, and at some point we just started talking. The way you talk with someone when there's no performance in it. And the afternoon went somewhere I hadn't expected. She told me about her first year of teaching. A classroom of grade 2s in a portable with a broken heater one January in the PN. How she brought her own space heater from home and got a call from the principal, and she said, respectfully, "Try and stop me." She made me laugh so hard I nearly burned the garlic. I told her about the early years of my marriage when my wife and I were broke and spent our first Christmas in a rented apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Vanier with a hot plate and an argument about whether a microwave counted as a luxury. I hadn't told that story in years. It felt good to tell it. We ate around 5 o'clock. The chicken was extraordinary. I told her so, and she waved her hand like she was embarrassed. And then she smiled and said thank you. My mom would have been pleased. After dinner we did the dishes together, standing side by side at her sink with the window in front of us going dark and the snow still falling outside. She washed and I dried, and we didn't talk much, and that was fine. That was more than fine. There's a kind of quiet with some people that isn't empty. It has weight to it, good weight, the way a blanket does. I drove home late that night feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, or not only that, more like rightness, like I'd remembered something I'd forgotten I knew. My son called on the 26th. "Hey, Dad, how was your Christmas?" I told him I'd spent it with a friend. A friend. A good friend. He was quiet for a second. Then, Dad, are you seeing someone? We've been spending some time together, yes. I could hear him smiling through the phone. He asked me a few questions, not prying ones, just genuine ones. And when I told him about the woodworking class and the crooked step stool and June handing me the clamp, he laughed and said, "That is the most you thing I've ever heard." He said he was glad. He said it simply, the way he says things, without making a whole production of it. I appreciate that about him. I always have. He asked if my daughter knew. No, I said. He didn't say anything else about it. She found out the way people find out things now. A photo. June has a daughter who lives in Toronto, and on Boxing Day, June's daughter called, and they did a video chat, and at some point June turned the camera around to show her the apartment and the dinner she'd made, and I was sitting there at the table in the background with my glass of wine, clearly comfortable, clearly not a stranger. June's daughter asked who I was. June told her. June's daughter mentioned it to her own friend who happened to follow my daughter on Instagram, and that friend, who had never met me in her life, sent my daughter a message saying, "That your dad? He looks happy." My daughter looked at the screenshot for a long time, apparently. Then she called me. I was home by then, reading in my armchair with the lamp on, and I felt my phone buzz on the side table. My daughter, I answered. She didn't say hello, she said, "Dad, who is that woman?" I said, "It's good to hear from you. How was your Christmas?" "Dad, how were Colton's parents?" "Dad, I need you to answer me." I waited a moment. Then I said, "She's a friend I've made. We spent Christmas together. You spent Christmas with a woman I've never met. You spent Christmas with Colton's family," I said. "We both made choices." She was quiet. I'd never said anything like that to her before. In 4 years of letting things slide, of being gracious about the 26th, and the too small delivery suite and the text in November, I had never said the thing plainly out loud. I kept my voice even when I said it. I wasn't angry. I was just done pretending I hadn't noticed. She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Okay, you could have said something." "I did," I said. I said, "No problem. Have a good one." She was quiet again for a longer time. Then she said, "I didn't know you were lonely." And there it was. The thing she'd been telling herself. That I was fine. That I was managing. That because I hadn't complained, there was nothing to complain about. I said, "I wasn't lonely this Christmas." I heard her breath on the other end of the line. "I want to meet her," she finally said. "I know," I said. "We'll figure that out." There's a thing my wife used to say whenever one of the kids was being stubborn or proud. She'd say, "They just don't want to need us." She meant it kindly. She could see that needing people is hard for some of us, that being reminded you depend on someone can feel like vulnerability. And some people would rather keep a little distance than admit that. I think about that a lot when I think about my daughter now. I don't think she meant to make me feel invisible. I think she got busy and told herself I was fine, and then she got used to telling herself that, and eventually it stopped being a thought at all. I became part of the furniture. Still there, not really seen. The photo changed that, not because it made her jealous. Or not only that, it was more that it showed her something she hadn't let herself look at. That her father, the man who'd lived in that house alone for 4 years, who'd driven himself home on Boxing Day and made no fuss about it, had gone ahead and made a life without asking permission, without waiting to be included, had found a warm kitchen and a woman who laughed without apology and had sat there in that apartment on Christmas Day like a man who knew he deserved to be comfortable. I think that scared her a little. I think it should have. We had a family dinner in late January. My son flew in from Victoria. He said he'd been meaning to come anyway, which was generous of him. My daughter and Colton and the kids drove in from Kanata. I picked June up at her apartment at noon, and we drove out together. She brought a coffee cake she'd made from an old recipe of her mother's. My grandkids were suspicious of it because it had raisins, And then they tried it and decided the raisins were acceptable. My granddaughter sat next to June at the table and told her very seriously about the book she was reading, and June listened the way teachers listen, which is completely, and my granddaughter glowed. My daughter was quiet at first, not cold, just careful. She helped in the kitchen and made polite conversation, and at one point, when we were alone for a minute by the back door, she said, "She seems nice, Dad." I said, "She is." My daughter looked at me for a moment. There was something working in her face that I recognized, the expression she used to get as a kid when she'd done something she knew wasn't right and was trying to find the words for it. She never liked apologizing. She got that from me. She said, "I should have thought more about Christmas." I said, "It worked out." "That's not an answer." "I know," I said, "but it's what I've got right now." She nodded. I think she understood that this was what repair looks like between us. Not a big reckoning, not a single conversation that makes everything square, but a beginning, an acknowledgement that something had gone sideways and we'd chosen to keep going anyway. We went back inside. June was at the kitchen table, doing a drawing with my granddaughter, both of them bent over the paper with their tongues pressed to their teeth, in concentration, and the sight of it stopped me in the doorway for a second. My son appeared beside me. He looked at the table and then at me. "Woodworking class," he said. "Woodworking class," I agreed. He put his arm around my shoulder for a moment, and that was all. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for me or to judge my daughter. She's not a villain. She's a person who got distracted and made assumptions, and most of us have been that person at some point. I know I have. I tell it because of something June said to me a few weeks after Christmas, when we were back at the woodworking class and my step stool was finally starting to look like a step stool. She said, "You know what took me the longest to learn? That you don't have to wait." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You wait, and you wait for people to see you, to include you, to make room. And sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And while you're waiting, you're missing the thing that's right in front of you." She tapped my workbench with one finger. You could have waited another Christmas for her to remember to include you. Or you could make a Christmas that was actually worth having. I thought about that for a long time. She was right. I hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I hadn't been strategic or calculated. I'd simply, for once, stopped waiting. I'd just decided I was worth showing up for. And it turned out that was the thing. The only thing that changed everything else. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that Christmas. Not the photo, not the 9 phone calls, not the January dinner where my granddaughter decided raisins were acceptable after all. The thing underneath all of it, what happened, was simple, and it took me embarrassingly long to understand it. I'd spent 4 years making myself small so that nobody would feel inconvenienced by my grief, or my needs, or my continued existence as a person who wanted things. I told myself that was grace, that it was patience, that good fathers don't make their children feel guilty. And some of that was true. But some of it, if I'm being straight with myself, was fear. Fear that if I asked for more, I'd get less. That if I said, "This isn't enough," the answer would be then, "That's all you get." So I said nothing. I accepted the 26th instead of the 25th. I drove home alone in the dark on the 417 and told myself it was fine. I read the text in November and typed 4 words back and put my phone face down on the counter. And what did my silence teach my daughter? It taught her I was fine. It confirmed, every single time, that she didn't need to think harder about me. My patience looked, from where she was standing, like proof that nothing needed to change. That's the thing about quietly absorbing something that isn't right. The other person doesn't see the absorbing. They just see the surface, calm, agreeable, no complaints, and they take it as permission to keep going. I didn't set out to change any of that when I called June and asked about Christmas. I genuinely just wanted to spend the day with someone who was glad to have me there. That was the whole of it. But the consequence, the thing that followed naturally from one honest choice, was that my daughter saw, maybe for the first time, that I had not been sitting still waiting for her, that I had a life with texture and warmth in it, and I hadn't needed her permission to build it. That's what the photo showed her. Not a betrayal. A life. And I think what my daughter had to reckon with. Quietly, privately, in whatever way she works through things, was the gap between the father she'd imagined and the one who'd actually been there. The one who'd driven 6 hours to her graduation, sat 4 hours in a waiting room without a word of complaint, made no fuss about Boxing Day. The one who, when told he wasn't immediate family, said no problem and meant it differently than she'd heard it. We haven't had a big conversation about any of this. We probably won't. That's not how we are. But something shifted after that January dinner. She calls more. Not a lot more, but more. And when she calls, she asks actual questions. How are you doing? What are you working on? How's June? That last one took a few months to arrive. But it arrived. June would say, I'm making this too neat. She'd be right. Real repair is slow and uneven, and sometimes you think you're further along than you are. But I do believe that the direction of a thing matters more than its pace. We are moving in the right direction. That's not nothing. What I'd say, if someone asked me what I actually learned, not as a lesson, just as something I now carry around and find useful, is this: the people in your life will generally treat you the way you've shown them you expect to be treated. Not out of cruelty, just out of habit, and ease, and the very human tendency to take the path of least resistance. When you quietly accept less, less becomes the norm. When you, without drama or ultimatum, simply go and build something worth having, that changes the norm too. I didn't punish my daughter. I didn't make a speech. I just stopped waiting to be included and went ahead and lived, and it turned out that was the most clarifying thing I could have done. For both of us. That Christmas at June's apartment, standing at her kitchen sink with the snow coming down outside and nothing much being said, that was mine. I chose it. And I think that might be the whole lesson, if there is one, that you are allowed to choose, that choosing yourself is not the same as abandoning anyone else, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people who've been taking you for granted is to quietly, without anger, show them what they've been taking.